Hey there, and welcome to the very first episode of We're Doing This. I'm your host, Dr. J, a licensed therapist in the DMV area. We're Doing This will be a weekly podcast about emotional intelligence in everyday situations and how to improve the ways we move through this world, one moment at a time. So every time we ask ourselves, we're doing this, we'll respond with, nope, we're doing this. Today, we're diving into the world of non-apologies. Non-apologies are like a dance of words masquerading as expressions of remorse, when in reality, it's avoiding accountability. But before we get started, although I am a licensed therapist in Maryland, any advice, suggestions, or feedback shared is not a substitute nor replacement to engaging in a therapeutic relationship with a licensed professional in your area. Emotional intelligence is also known as EQ. The EQ components we will cover today are self-awareness and relationship management. Let's start by defining non-apologies. Non-apologies are when someone says they're sorry, but don't actually take responsibility for their actions or express genuine remorse. Instead, they may make excuses, shift blame, or minimize the impact of their behavior. Essentially, it's an apology without sincerity or accountability. Now, there are some perceived benefits to non apologies. So let's explore a few of them. Maintaining image. Now, if you are a person who might be in a public eye or you have a high expectation or impression of yourself, you may feel the need to save face or preserve your image or your reputation. This often happens with public figures. However, it can happen with people in our day-to-day lives. When a person is trying to preserve their image, quite often it has to do with their ego and not wanting to ruffle the feathers of their impression of themselves. This is where self-awareness comes into play, because if you don't know yourself, then you don't know the kinds of ways that you project and show up in the world, nor are you kind of concerned about how others might view you in a positive light, and actually just know that you're human. So even though they may perceive you in a very positive light, you're human. So therefore, you're going to have times and occasions when you're going to be flawed. So people with not a good necessarily impression of self-awareness of themselves don't can't reconcile that within themselves. They sometimes say, oh, well, I have the image to uphold. You'll hear people say that often. And so when that takes place, then non-apologies are very often the mode of apologizing without really apologizing. Another way that people um, have a non-apology is by not admitting fault and hope that there are no legal or financial repercussions for their actions. So they avoid consequences. I was listening to a segment on Instagram the other day, and it had to do with a pretty popular podcast show. And one of the people on there, one of the hosts, was non apologizing for something that was said about Ressa Tessa or Risa Tisa. I can't remember how you pronounce her name. The lady who did the 52 episode um, TikTok podcast about her and her husband and her marriage. And so when I heard the apology, I was like, that's not an apology. All you did was say, all you did was deflect, really, and say, well, I really wasn't talking about her. I was talking about people who do this, not necessarily about her specifically. But it was a veiled, attempt to apologize, because clearly, if you looked at the previous clip from Instagram, he was clearly talking about her. He clearly was referencing her without saying her name. So that's just a way to avoid consequences and kind of make yourself look better in the public eye. Another reason why a person may do a non apology is to preserve a relationship. Sometimes non apologies are seen as a way of smoothing things over without causing any further conflict and shaking up things in the relationship, just to kind of like put a band aid on it and let's keep moving and just kind of say, okay, all's forgiven, all's well. In these kinds of situations, the preservation, although the intention behind the non apology is admirable because you want to preserve the relationship, I think sometimes we need to think about what's the purpose of the preservation? And is the preservation really a genuine preservation? Or is it just kind of a glossing over the situation and just kind of get to the next point in the relationship or the next point in the conversation? So we'll delve into that a little bit later, but that's just one of the perceived benefits of a non apology. And last but not least, of the perceived benefits is being the grown up. Now, this is my personal favorite because I do this often. I feel as though I've done nothing wrong, and I am self aware enough to know when I have done something wrong, or it's possible that someone might have taken something I did unintentionally, of course, and taking it a different way other than the way in which I intended. So in this particular being the grown up part of a non apology, you say that, okay, I'm going to apologize because at this point, we're at a standstill. No one is going to, move forward. And so, what's the best way to get through this without, without acknowledging that I did something wrong or the person did something wrong when you know you didn't do anything wrong? Right. And so sometimes a non apology is necessary because that other person who feels offended is 10 toes down and feels like, they're deserving of an apology. But then when you're standing 10 toes down and you're like, I didn't do anything that needs an apology, that I need to apologize for, then where do we go from there? And sometimes you have to be the one who's emotionally intelligent enough to say, you know what? It's not even worth it to be right, even though you know you're right. It's not even worth it to be right. Just go ahead and apologize, let it go, move on. But, the apology is not really an apology because you really didn't feel like you did anything wrong. So that's where the self-awareness component of emotional intelligence and the relationship management of EQ kind of come into play, because you're managing the relationship and you're also self-aware enough to know that you have to be the bigger person. You have to be the grown-up in this situation because the other person is not budging. And if you have two people who are 10 toes down, not budging, then we're at a standstill and we're pretty much making ourselves into a conflict that doesn't need to be a conflict because somebody can end it. And if you have enough emotional intelligence within you to stop and to say, you know what, this is not even worth it, just go ahead and apologize, then that's what you'll do. You'll go ahead and apologize, even though you know you're not supposed to, or even though you don't feel like you should apologize. Next, we'll go into the cons of non apologies. Well, I mean, those are kind of obvious, but we'll go through them. Some of the cons of non apologies are lack of accountability, where the people who don't apologize or give the fake apologies, they're not really held accountable for their actions because they minimize their behavior. And so admitting fault can feel like a blow to their pride. And instead of owning up for their mistakes, they kind of give a half hearted apology to shift the blame from themselves to someone else. So they may say, well, you feel that way, but nobody else feels that way. Something to that effect. So it's really a way to kind of blame shift. And if you take the blame and the shift and you kind of just use it as an acronym, you get where I'm going with it, right? So lack of accountability can be one aspect of a con as it pertains to non apologies. Another one is the undermining of trust. Because if I know that you are non apologizing and you aren't even emotionally intelligent enough to say, you know what? Okay, I I don't agree with what you're saying, but I could see how you might feel that way. So I'll go ahead and apologize. If you don't give a sincere apology, or you give an apology that's kind of like a non apology, that could undermine trust because that person might feel like you genuinely don't even feel like you need to give them an apology. And you would lack sincerity in that apology because, again, you don't feel like you need to give them an apology. And when you have a lack of trust, it makes it hard to rebuild relationships. It makes it hard to maintain relationships because the trust is pretty much gone, that you don't even value them enough to give them a sincere apology. Now, again, apologies are more so for the other person than it is for the person who's giving it. Let's be clear. I am very, adamant and convicted on that an apology is not necessarily for the person giving it, it's always for the person who's receiving it. So, if you are trying to rebuild, maintain trust, a sincere apology is for them. It's not for you. And it definitely undermines trust when there's a lack of sincerity, a lack of accountability, or even acknowledgement that not that there's necessarily a wrongdoing, but that there could be a perceived wrongdoing, because perception is always reality. And whether we want to believe that, oh, how could you ever possibly perceive that? People do. And that's the reality of it. People do perceive things that are not necessarily perception to everybody else. And so we can't deal with what everybody else thinks. We have to look at what does that person believe and how to rebuild or maintain trust within that relationship. Sometimes non-apologies can escalate the conflict because if you give a non-apology to a person who's non-confrontational, then they're thinking in their back of their mind like, oh, you're playing me for dumb. And so then you know, creates a, okay, I'm gonna stick this in the back and categorize it, log it in for later. And then the next thing that a person does, then they're like, oh, okay, you're not gonna take accountability for this either. And then it becomes an escalation of, you know, I know that you're not gonna be woman enough, man enough to accept responsibility for your actions. And so it then creates a conflict, and it grows and grows and festers because you know that that person is not going to apologize. They're just not. And so, how can you maintain a relationship with someone who can't take accountability for their actions, who is going to continue to let this conflict escalate and not have enough um, worthwhileness, interest, dedication, loyalty to your relationship and to your friendship to try to seek some kind of a mutually agreed upon resolution. So, if you find someone who's giving you a non apology and it's only causing a festering or a continuation or escalation in the conflict, then you have to ask yourself, as the person who's in receipt of the non apology, is this relationship really worth it? And is this something I really want to continue to be involved in? Because that person clearly is not invested in me the way I think that I am invested in the relationship. So, some real life examples of how non apologies work is the classic I'm sorry if you were offended, or um, I'm sorry, but this is just the way I am. I'm sorry if you feel like I did something or did something or said something to hurt you, or I'm sorry you feel that way, or I'm sorry I just don't see this as a big deal. When people say things like that, then it's pretty much it's your problem, really, not mine. And so I'm just telling you this to, pacify you so we can move on. And when people do that, you can either feel like, if you're not aware, right, of the apology, of the non apology, you might say, oh, okay, they apologized. But then if you sit and you kind of really think and explore and kind of dissect and, tease out the actual words that were said, you'll come to the conclusion that it wasn't really an apology. It was a, you feel that way, so I apologize. But not that I acknowledge I did something, said something to you that hurt you. Now, again, perception is reality. And so there are times when people are on their own island, in their own world, in their own head, And it really has nothing to do with you. It really has everything to do with them. But again, that's when your EQ kicks in and you are able to use relationship management to see, like, oh, okay, this is not me. This is them. And also, even when you're doing the grown up non-apology, as I like to call it, and you're doing any of the apologies that are in the so-called pro uh, you know, beneficial reasons for a non-apology, you always have to think to yourself, is this worth being insincere? Now, I know a lot of people who, if you didn't do it, you don't feel like you should apologize. And I get it, right? Because who wants to apologize for something that they don't really feel like they did? And who wants to really apologize for something like, it's basically a fake apology anyway? If I don't feel like I did something to hurt you, whether or not you believe I did or not, if I don't feel like my intention was to hurt you, to harm you, to make you feel less than, and I apologize, then what about my feelings? What about my self worth, my self awareness, a management of my own emotions? Well, again, that's where emotional intelligence comes in, and you have to be aware enough to know that your ego can take this. Your ego is not going to be damaged or ruined by accepting responsibility or apologizing for the impact of your word or your actions on someone else when your actions were not meant to do so. People can perceive whatever they want, but it's our actions and our intention behind it that I think make a little bit of a difference. But not everyone can accept that. Not everyone can accept that my intention should drive my apology. Some people want an apology regardless. Whether your intention was to do it or not to do it, the end result is still the same. They were hurt, they were offended, they want an apology. And in those cases, you need to really have enough emotional intelligence to reconcile with yourself that whether intentional or not, you're going to have to decide if this relationship is worth you giving a non-apology or even an apology when you know that you're not wrong. So, how can we navigate non-apologies? By first realizing that sometimes there are misunderstandings that have less to do with you and more to do with the perception about you or even childhood or present day trauma. Second, by acknowledging that regardless of the origin of the feelings involved, it's essential that these situations are handled with empathy and transparency. Third, by giving an apology based on what the perception of that other person in the situation. I can't say it enough. Perception is reality. Agreement with that other person's perception is not a prerequisite for an apology. Just acknowledgement of the other person's feelings and their perceptions. Again, let me say it again. Agreement with the need for an apology is not a prerequisite. Sometimes you just have to acknowledge that that person perceives that they have experienced a wrongdoing, and then an apology is necessary. Now, should the person who is in need of the apology, should they forgive? Well, again, that goes, in my opinion, they should forgive whether they get an apology or a non-apology, because the person didn't have to apologize at all. Whether apology or a non-apology, they didn't have to say anything. They could have said, "Oh well," and left it alone. You know, you forgive somebody, I would think, just me, I would think that you should, especially if it is unintentional, that forgiveness should be there, because that person leveraged enough of the relationship to say, you know what, I didn't do anything wrong. I understand you perceive I did something wrong, but I really didn't do anything wrong intentionally. So therefore, I'm going to go ahead and give you this apology. Sincere or not, I'm going to give it to you, and let's move on. And so if you forgive, as the person who is the recipient of the apology, if you forgive that person for the offense, then that's on you. I think forgiveness, should happen regardless, because the person didn't have to do anything. But, that's just my thought on it. At the end of the day, accountability is key. And owning our mistakes, no matter how uncomfortable, is the first step towards healing. A genuine apology focuses on repairing the damage done and restoring trust, regardless of intention. So, I know that there are some people out there that are like, well, how can you give a genuine apology when you don't feel like you've done anything wrong? Well, I can answer that. How you give a genuine apology without feeling that you've done anything wrong is by not focusing on whether you did anything wrong, but focusing on the other person's needs, relationship management, focusing on the other person's needs, repairing the damage that has been done in their mind. Again, you don't have to agree that a wrongdoing has been done. You just have to acknowledge that the other person feels that a wrong has been done. And in order to restore trust, you have to leverage and understand that your apology is less about you and more about them. As we wrap things up, remember that words can hurt or heal. Genuine remorse and accountability are crucial for understanding, empathy, healing, and growth. So the next time you're inclined to give or accept a non apology, think about ways to demonstrate and strive towards authenticity. Until next time, keep questioning, keep reflecting, and keep growing your emotional intelligence.